Have you ever felt invisible? Imagine standing in a room full of people who used to be your world, watching your ex-husband flaunt his new, younger wife. You can feel the whispers, the pitying stares, the crushing weight of being yesterday's news. That was Clara Moreau's reality. A woman discarded for a shinier model. But what happens when the most powerful, enigmatic man in the city, a billionaire nobody can get close to, walks past everyone, looks right at you, and changes your entire world with a single public kiss? This isn't just a story of revenge. It's about the moment a forgotten woman remembers her own power, and the man who threw her away is forced to watch her rise. The invitation had arrived a week ago, a thick slice of ivory cardstock resting on her reclaimed wood coffee table like a ghost. The embossed gold lettering of the Metropolitan Foundation Gala glittered under the soft light of Clara's Brooklyn apartment. An annual event, a universe she had once orbited, a universe that belonged to David. Clara Moreau ran her thumb over the sharp edge. For 5 years, this gala had been a landmark in her calendar, a night of borrowed diamonds and strained smiles, of holding David's arm so tightly her knuckles went white. She was Mrs. Miller then, the quiet, elegant accessory to an investment banker on a meteoric rise. Her own career, landscape architecture, had been neatly packed away like winter clothes, a hobby, he'd called it, something to keep her busy while he built their empire. After the divorce, the empire had turned out to be his alone. Now, a year later, the invitation felt like a test, a dare. Her freelance business was finally gaining traction, a small but steady stream of clients who wanted her thoughtful, sustainable garden designs. She was paying her own bills, watering her own plants, sleeping diagonally across her own bed. She was healing. But was she healed enough for this? "You should go," her friend Maya had insisted over the phone. "You need to walk into that room and own it. Show him you're not just surviving, you're thriving." Thriving felt like a strong word. Breathing most days felt like a victory. But Maya was right. Hiding felt like letting him win. So Clara had pulled out the one dress David had always hated. It was a deep emerald green, a slip of silk that clung and flowed in ways he'd deemed unbecoming for a banker's wife. It was her dress. Tonight she would be Clara Moreau, not a ghost of a Mrs. The ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a dizzying constellation of crystal and champagne. The air hummed with the electric current of money and influence. Clara took a flute from a passing tray, the bubbles a welcome sting against her tongue. She kept to the perimeter, a satellite in a galaxy of stars, observing the familiar faces. They nodded, their eyes flicking with a brief, pitying curiosity before moving on. She was a piece of gossip that had long gone cold. Then she saw them. David stood near the marble staircase, a king in his court. He looked the same, impeccably tailored tuxedo, a confident smile that never quite reached his eyes. But the woman on his arm was new, Sophie Vance. Clara knew of her, of course, the daughter of a real estate tycoon, 24 years old, with a face like a porcelain doll and eyes that held a glint of hard-won possession. The diamond on her finger was an iceberg, catching the light and fracturing it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. It was twice the size of the one he'd given Clara. Clara's breath hitched. She had prepared for this, rehearsed her cool, indifferent smile in the mirror. But the reality of it, the sheer, blatant upgrade, was a physical blow. Sophie laughed, a tinkling sound that carried across the room, and leaned in to whisper something in David's ear. He smirked, his gaze sweeping the crowd with proprietary arrogance. For a moment their eyes met. Across the expanse of shimmering gowns and black ties, David saw her. The smirk on his face didn't falter, but something else flickered in his eyes. Surprise? Annoyance? Clara couldn't tell. He held her gaze for a beat too long, a silent acknowledgement of the history that lay between them like a minefield. Then he turned his attention back to Sophie, dismissing her. The cut was so sharp, so absolute, it stole the air from her lungs. She had been the woman who straightened that very tie, who reminded him of his colleague's wife's name, who soothed his ego after a bad day at the market. Now she was a stranger across a crowded room, a ghost in a green dress. Maya was wrong. Coming here wasn't a triumph. It was a self-inflicted wound. Clutching her small bag, Clara turned, desperate for an escape, for a quiet corner where she could piece her shattered composure back together. From David Miller's perspective, the world was exactly as it should be. The champagne was crisp, the air was thick with the scent of success, and Sophie, his perfect pedigreed wife, was a warm and beautiful weight on his arm. He was 35, a senior VP at a top firm, and married into a dynasty. He had orchestrated his life with the precision of a master strategist. Seeing Clara was an unexpected and slightly irritating variable. She stood alone near the bar, looking startlingly good in that green dress he'd always despised. It was too much, too revealing of the graceful lines of her body, the curve of her back. It was a dress for an artist, not a wife. For a moment, a phantom memory surfaced. Clara, years ago, sketching in a notebook, her face smudged with charcoal, alight with a passion he'd never fully understood and had over time quietly extinguished. He pushed the thought away. He had made the right choice. Clara was his starter wife, the woman who had been suitable for his ascent. But to break into the stratosphere, he needed someone like Sophie, a woman who wasn't just an accessory, but a statement. Sophie's father had opened doors he couldn't have even found on his own. Their marriage was a merger, and the returns were spectacular. "Who is that?" Sophie's voice was a soft murmur, but it had an edge of steel. Her eyes were fixed on Clara. "No one important," David said a little too quickly. "Just my ex." Sophie's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. "That's her, the gardener?" David flinched at the term. "Landscape architect," he corrected automatically. "It was a hobby." "Well, she's here, alone." Sophie's grip on his arm tightened. "Are you going to say hello? It would be rude not to." What she meant was, "I want to see her up close. I want to assess the threat." He knew it was a test. To ignore Clara would suggest she still held power over him. To engage was to demonstrate his complete and utter indifference. "Of course," he said smoothly. He led Sophie across the floor, feeling the subtle shift in attention as people watched them. They were the room's power couple. The approach felt like a victory lap. "Clara," he said, his voice a smooth blend of surprise and condescension. "I didn't expect to see you here." Clara turned, her face a carefully composed mask of polite neutrality. Her eyes, the color of warm whiskey, met his, and for a second he felt a jolt of the old connection, the shared language of a decade together. "David, Sophie, you make a lovely couple." "Thank you," Sophie chirped, her smile dazzling and sharp. She extended a hand, the massive diamond practically winking at Clara. "It's so brave of you to come to these things alone. I would just feel so out of place." It was a masterfully delivered insult, wrapped in a veneer of sympathy. Clara's hand didn't tremble as she shook Sophie's. "I'm here as a guest of the foundation," she said, her voice steady. "They're interested in a potential collaboration for the new conservatory gardens." David's smile tightened. A collaboration? His Clara? It had to be a lie, a pathetic attempt to save face. "That's nice," he said dismissively. "Good for you, keeping busy with your little garden business." The words hung in the air, dripping with the poison of his condescension. He saw a flicker of pain in her eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a cool, unreadable calm. "It's more than a business, David. It's my work," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Something I'm sure you wouldn't understand." The retort, so unlike the compliant woman he remembered, caught him off guard. Before he could formulate a suitably cutting reply, she gave them a small final nod. "Enjoy your evening." She turned and walked away, her green dress shimmering under the chandeliers. David watched her go, a strange, bitter taste in his mouth. The encounter hadn't brought the smug satisfaction he'd expected. Instead, he felt an unfamiliar prickle of unease. He had wanted to show her what she'd lost, but as she disappeared into the crowd, poised and unbroken, he was left with the unsettling feeling that he was the one who had miscalculated. The balcony was a sanctuary. Clara pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped into the cool night air. The city's roar softened to a distant hum. Below, Central Park was a vast, dark ocean of trees under a blanket of stars. She leaned against the cold stone balustrade, taking deep, shaky breaths, willing the hot tears behind her eyes to recede. The cruelty of David's words, the polished venom in Sophie's, had landed exactly as intended. Little garden business. He had made her feel so small, reducing her life's passion to a trivial pastime. For years she had believed him. She had allowed her ambitions to shrink until they could fit into the small, decorative box he had designed for her. A quiet voice beside her broke the silence. The Gardens of Versailles theme for the rooftop terrace was a bit on the nose, don't you think? Clara turned, startled. A man stood a few feet away, leaning against the railing, his tuxedo impeccably cut but worn with a casual ease. He was tall, with dark hair and startlingly intelligent grey eyes that seemed to absorb the city lights. She didn't recognize him, yet there was an aura of quiet authority about him. A little, she admitted, her voice hoarse. All that rigid geometry. It feels like nature being forced to behave. Precisely, he said, his lips curving into a slight smile. There's no room for discovery. It's a garden that gives away all its secrets at first glance. He paused, his gaze thoughtful. Not like your Elysian Fields project. Clara froze. I'm sorry? Your university thesis, he clarified. The design for a public park based on the principles of regenerative wilderness. Winding paths, hidden clearings, native species. A garden that unfolds. I remember the sketches. They were brilliant. Clara stared at him, bewildered. No one had mentioned that project in over a decade. It was a dream she'd had in another lifetime, a version of herself she had almost forgotten existed. How? How could you possibly know about that? I make it my business to know about brilliant things, he said simply. He extended a hand. Liam Sterling. The name registered with a jolt. Liam Sterling. The reclusive tech billionaire. The man who had revolutionized data security, whose company was whispered about with the kind of reverence usually reserved for deities. He was a legend, notoriously private, almost never photographed, and he was standing on a balcony talking to her about a student project she'd completed 12 years ago. Clara Moreau, she managed, her hand feeling small in his warm, firm grip. I know, he said, his grey eyes holding hers. I was a judge at the National Student Design Competition that year. Your project should have won. It was audacious. It had soul. Clara felt a dizzying wave of vertigo. She had come in second place. The loss had been a sharp disappointment, one of the first of many compromises she had made for a life with David, who had called her ambition unrealistic. You were a judge? A silent one. I sponsored the grant, he explained. My sister, she was studying to be an architect. She was obsessed with your work. She believed design should serve communities, not just egos. He looked out over the park, a shadow of sadness passing over his features. She would have loved what you're doing now. The encounter with David and Sophie had been designed to make her feel worthless. Yet here was Liam Sterling, a man of immense stature, validating a part of her she thought was long dead. He hadn't mentioned David. He hadn't offered pity. He had seen her. The landscape architect, the creator. Thank you, she said, the words feeling inadequate. No one has said anything like that to me in a very long time. Then they haven't been paying attention, he replied, his voice soft but certain. They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the city lights painting a glittering canvas before them. For the first time all evening, Clara felt her shoulders relax. The knot of humiliation in her stomach began to loosen. Liam Sterling wasn't just an anchor in her swirling sea of anxiety. He was a lighthouse, illuminating a shoreline she had forgotten she was sailing toward. A shoreline that was entirely her own. David was holding court, a half-empty glass of Macallan 25 in his hand, regaling a small circle of associates with a story about a recent acquisition. He was in his element, the center of attention, the master of his universe. But his eyes kept drifting, scanning the crowd for a flash of emerald green. He told himself it was just to ensure Clara had the good sense to leave, to not cause a scene. But a deeper, more irritating feeling gnawed at him. Her composure had unsettled him. The old Clara would have been flustered, perhaps even shed a tear. This Clara had been formidable. Then he saw her. She was on the balcony, and she wasn't alone. She was with Liam Sterling. David's story faltered mid-sentence. His associate, Mark, followed his gaze. "Is that Sterling?" Mark whispered, his voice filled with awe. "I didn't even know he was here. Who's he with?" "My ex-wife," David said, the words tasting like ash. The circle of men fell silent, their eyes flicking between the balcony and David's face. The power dynamic in the small group shifted instantly. David was no longer the focus. Liam Sterling was the sun, and everyone else was just a planet. "What the hell is Sterling doing with her?" Sophie hissed, appearing at his elbow. Her porcelain doll face was tight with anxiety. "David, do you understand who that is? My father has been trying to get a meeting with him for 6 months. And he's talking to your gardener." "She's not my gardener," David snapped, his temper flaring. The insecurity was a hot, coiling snake in his gut. Why was Sterling talking to her? Had she concocted some sob story about their divorce? Was she trying to poison his reputation? The possibilities, each more damaging than the last, raced through his mind. He watched them, his jaw clenched. They weren't just talking. Clara was smiling, a genuine, unguarded smile he hadn't seen on her face in years. It was the smile she used to have when she was lost in her designs, the one that had first captivated him before he'd decided it was an impractical distraction. Sterling listened intently, his focus entirely on her. They looked comfortable, intimate. A primitive, ugly jealousy clawed at David. It made no sense. He didn't want Clara. He had Sophie, the ultimate trophy. But the sight of Clara, his discarded wife, being treated as an equal by a man like Liam Sterling, was an affront. It was a violation of the narrative he had so carefully constructed, the narrative where he was the victor and she was the footnote. Clara and Sterling turned to leave the balcony, walking back into the ballroom. As they approached the grand foyer, Clara paused, as if to say goodnight. David held his breath, praying they would part ways, that this bizarre interlude would be over. But Sterling didn't let her go. He reached out, his hand gently touching her arm. He said something too low for anyone to hear, and then, in the center of the grand foyer, under the full blaze of the crystal chandeliers, Liam Sterling leaned down and kissed Clara Moreau. It wasn't a dramatic, passionate clinch. It was something far more devastating. It was slow, deliberate, and deeply tender. A kiss of unmistakable meaning. It was a public declaration. 100 conversations stopped mid-sentence. A collective, silent gasp seemed to suck the air from the room. The flashes of photographers' cameras, which had been focused on politicians and celebrities, all swiveled in their direction, erupting in a blinding strobe of light. David froze. The crystal tumbler in his hand felt slick with sweat. His vision tunneled until the only thing he could see was them. He saw the woman he had called unimportant, the woman he had dismissed and belittled, being publicly claimed, publicly treasured, by a man whose power dwarfed his own into insignificance. The kiss ended. Sterling's hand rested for a moment on the small of Clara's back as he guided her toward the exit, shielding her from the sudden onslaught of attention. The world David had built with such meticulous care, a world based on image, power, and the perception of others, didn't just crack. It shattered. In that single silent moment, he wasn't David Miller, the titan of finance. He was just the man who had let Clara Moreau go, the fool who had thrown away a diamond, convinced it was just a stone. The next morning, the world had been redrawn. Clara's face was on the cover of every society blog and gossip column. "Billionaire's mystery woman," screamed one headline. "Sterling's shocking gala kiss," declared another. Her phone buzzed incessantly on her nightstand, a frantic, angry hornet. She had turned it on silent, pulling the covers over her head as if she could hide from the tidal wave that had just crashed over her life. She felt a dizzying mix of emotions: embarrassment at the public spectacle, fear of the unwanted attention, but also beneath it all, a strange, unfamiliar flicker of power. The pitying looks from the night before had been replaced by a firestorm of intrigue. No one was calling her David's ex-wife anymore. They were calling her Liam Sterling's mystery woman. Just after 9, a text message cut through the noise. It was from an unknown number. "Clara, I owe you an apology for the spectacle. And an explanation. Would you have dinner with me tonight? LS." Her fingers trembled as she typed a simple yes. That evening, he didn't take her to a flashy, Michelin-starred restaurant where they would be photographed. He sent a discreet car to a quiet, elegant brownstone in the West Village, which turned out to be his private residence. The interior was minimalist and warm, filled with books and art, not the cold, sterile trappings of wealth she had expected. They ate at a simple wooden table in a kitchen that was clearly used. A chef he introduced as Marco, serving them a delicious, unfussy pasta. There were no pretenses. "First," Liam began, setting down his wineglass, "I am truly sorry. I put you in an impossible position. It was impulsive and unfair to you." "Why did you do it?" Clara asked, the question she had been turning over in her mind all day. Liam's gaze was direct. "I told you about my sister Anna," he said. "She was 2 years behind you at Columbia. She followed your work obsessively. She used to say, 'Clara Moreau designs with empathy. She builds spaces that heal people.'" He paused, a wave of old grief washing over his features. "Anna passed away a few months after that competition. A car accident. Her death, it hollowed me out. When I sold my first company, I started a foundation in her name, the Anna Sterling Foundation. Its mission is to fund female architects and designers who focus on public, community-oriented projects. The kind of work she wanted to do, the kind of work you do." Clara listened, her heart aching for his loss. "I've followed your career, Clara, or rather, the lack of it," he continued, his voice hardening slightly. "I saw you win awards, get noticed, and then you married David Miller, and you disappeared. Your talent was just gone, subsumed. I saw you last night, standing alone, and I watched him approach you with his new wife. I saw the condescension in his eyes, the way he tried to make you feel small, and it made me furious." He leaned forward, his voice low and intense. "It was the same look of dismissive arrogance I've seen from men in boardrooms my entire life. The look that tells a woman her ideas are cute but not serious. I felt this protective rage on your behalf, on Anna's behalf." "So the kiss," Clara prompted softly. "It was 2 things," he admitted. "One part was an impulsive human desire to show the woman I saw standing on that balcony, a woman of substance and brilliance, that she was seen, that she was valued. But the other part," he gave a wry, self-deprecating smile, "was strategic. I knew a single photograph would instantly sever you from his narrative. You would no longer be David Miller's ex. You would be your own person, linked to a new story. I wanted to give you a clean break. A public reset." He looked at her, his grey eyes searching her face. It was a gambit, a high-handed, arrogant one, perhaps. But my motives were genuine. I want to help you reclaim what was taken from you. The foundation is looking for a lead architect for its flagship project, the Anna Sterling Memorial Garden in Brooklyn Bridge Park. I want it to be you, Clara." Clara was speechless. It was a dream project, a career-defining commission. He wasn't just offering her a life raft, he was offering her a fleet. He had seen the injustice of her story and had decided, with the immense power he wielded, to help her write a new ending. The kiss was not an act of possession, but an act of liberation. For the first time in years, Clara Moreau felt the solid ground of her own potential beneath her feet. The tears that pricked her eyes were not of humiliation or sadness, but of a profound, overwhelming gratitude. The photograph of the kiss was a bomb that detonated in the center of David Miller's curated life. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. On Monday morning, he was summoned to the office of his boss, Jonathan Westbrook, a man whose respect David had worked tirelessly to earn. He walked in expecting a slap on the back about a recent deal. Instead, Westbrook gestured to a chair, his face grim. On his desk lay a copy of the New York Post. The photo of Clara and Liam splashed across the page. "I got a call this morning from Sterling's office," Westbrook said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Cancelling his firm's accounts with us, all of them. That's a 9-figure portfolio, David. He gave no reason, just a change in direction. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" David felt the blood drain from his face. "Jonathan, this is my ex-wife. It has nothing to do with me." "Doesn't it?" Westbrook leaned back, his eyes like chips of ice. "The whole street is talking. Liam Sterling, who hasn't been publicly linked to a woman in a decade, is kissing your ex-wife the same weekend he pulls his business from your firm. It makes you look weak, David. It makes you look like a man who can't control his own house. And if you can't control your own house, how can you manage my client's money?" The message was clear. He was no longer an asset. He was a liability. The humiliation at work was just the beginning. At home, the atmosphere was glacial. Sophie, who had once looked at him with doe-eyed adoration, now watched him with a look of pure contempt. "This is a disaster," she said, throwing her iPad onto their white silk sofa. The screen showed an article detailing Clara's appointment as lead architect for the Anna Sterling Memorial Garden. "She's everywhere. They're calling her his muse. You told me she was a nobody. You told me she was a gardener with a hobby." "How was I supposed to know she knew Liam Sterling?" David shot back, his voice raw with frustration. "That's the point, David. You don't know anything." Sophie stood up, pacing their sterile, joyless living room. "I married you because you were powerful, because you were going places. You were supposed to elevate the Vance family name, not drag it through the mud with your messy, pathetic divorce. My father is furious. People are laughing at us." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. "I married you because you were powerful." It laid bare the truth of their relationship, a truth he had always known but had coated in a self-serving fantasy of love and desire. Their marriage was a transaction, and his stock was plummeting. The arguments became a daily ritual, each one more vicious than the last. She mocked his declining status at the firm. He accused her of being a shallow, spoiled child. The beautiful porcelain veneer of their perfect life had cracked, revealing the hollow, ugly emptiness beneath. He started drinking more, seeking solace in the bottom of a whiskey glass. He would sit alone in his study, scrolling through the endless articles about Clara and Liam. They were photographed visiting the site for the garden, deep in conversation. They looked like partners, equals. The reports spoke of Clara's visionary talent and resilient spirit. He was haunted by a memory. Years ago, Clara had tried to show him a design for a community garden in a low-income neighborhood. She had been so excited, her eyes shining. He had barely glanced at it. "There's no money in that, honey," he'd said, turning back to his market reports. "Focus on the house." Now, her vision was being funded by a billionaire, celebrated by the city, while his own carefully constructed world crumbled around him. He had thought power was about money, status, and control. But watching Clara rise from the ashes he had left her in, he began to understand. He hadn't just underestimated her. He had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of true worth. He had traded gold for glitter, and the bill was finally coming due. The site for the Anna Sterling Memorial Garden was a neglected 2-acre stretch of waterfront in Brooklyn Bridge Park. It was a tangle of weeds and cracked concrete, but to Clara, it was the most beautiful patch of land in New York City. It was a blank canvas. It was a promise. She threw herself into the work with a fervor she hadn't felt in a decade. The timid, accommodating woman who had tiptoed around David's ego was gone. In her place was an artist rediscovering her voice. She spent her days on site, her boots caked in mud, her hair tied back in a messy bun, sketching furiously in her notebook. She spent her nights at her drafting table, surrounded by blueprints and soil charts, fueled by coffee and a resurrected passion. Her design was the antithesis of the rigid, formal gardens of the wealthy elite. It was inspired by her old Elysian Fields project, but it was bolder, more mature. She designed a garden of healing with winding, accessible pathways that encouraged quiet contemplation. There was a sensory garden for children with disabilities, a wildflower meadow to attract native pollinators, and quiet, secluded alcoves with benches made from reclaimed timber. At its heart was a simple, elegant fountain, its gently flowing water meant to symbolize resilience and the continuity of life. Liam was a constant, quiet presence. He never interfered with her creative process, but he was always there to support it. He'd visit the site not as a billionaire benefactor, but as an engaged partner, listening intently as she explained the ecological significance of her plant choices. He learned the names of the species she selected: echinacea for strength, lavender for peace, willow for remembrance. Their relationship deepened, evolving organically from their shared purpose. They ate dinner at cheap, delicious noodle shops in her neighborhood after long days, their conversations meandering from architecture to technology to their shared, nerdy love of old science fiction novels. He made her laugh, a real deep belly laugh she hadn't realized she'd missed. One cool autumn evening, they were walking along the promenade, the lights of the Manhattan skyline glittering across the river. "You've given her a beautiful legacy," Clara said softly, looking back toward the garden site. "Anna would be so proud." "She would," Liam agreed. He stopped walking and turned to face her, his grey eyes serious in the twilight. "Clara, when I first approached you, my motives were complicated. I wanted to help you, but it was also about righting a wrong I saw done to my sister by proxy. It was about justice in a way." He reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his touch sending a warm shiver through her. "But it's not about that anymore. It hasn't been for a long time. I'm not interested in your past or in David Miller. I'm interested in you, in your brilliant mind, your kind heart, and the way your face lights up when you talk about root systems." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't a strategic alliance. This was real. "Liam," she started, but he silenced her by gently placing a finger on her lips. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "I know you're still healing. I can wait. I just wanted you to know." He didn't kiss her then. Instead, he simply took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, and they continued their walk. The gesture was more intimate, more profound than the public kiss that had shattered her old world. That kiss had been about liberation. This, the quiet holding of her hand, the patient promise in his eyes, was about building something new. She was no longer David Miller's ex-wife or Liam Sterling's pet project. She was Clara Moreau, the architect of her own life, standing beside a man who didn't want to dim her light, but wanted to watch her shine. And in the soil of her own reclaimed garden, a new and unexpected love was beginning to take root. David's world had shrunk. He lost the corner office, then the title, and finally the job itself. They called it a restructuring, but he knew the truth. He was tainted goods. His marriage was a hollow shell, filled only with Sophie's bitter recriminations and the silence of their separate bedrooms. He was adrift in the wreckage of his own making. In his desperation, his thoughts turned obsessively to Clara. She was the epicenter of his downfall, the cause of his humiliation. But she was also, his deluded mind began to whisper, his only way out. If he could just get back in her good graces, if he could somehow leverage her connection to Sterling, maybe he could salvage something. He found her one afternoon at the garden site. She was talking to a foreman, pointing at a blueprint, her expression animated and confident. She looked more vibrant, more alive than he had ever seen her. The sight of her, so completely in her element, sent a pang of something he couldn't name, envy, regret, loss, through him. He waited until she was alone, then approached, plastering a carefully rehearsed, remorseful smile on his face. "Clara," he said, his voice soft. She turned, and her smile vanished, replaced by a look of weary guardedness. "David, what are you doing here?" "I just wanted to see it," he said, gesturing vaguely at the burgeoning landscape. "It's incredible. You're incredible. I always knew you had this in you." The lie was so bald-faced it was almost comical. Clara's expression didn't change. "What do you want?" "I want to apologize," he said, trying to inject as much sincerity as he could muster. "For everything. I was an idiot, Clara. Ambitious and blind. I didn't appreciate you. I see that now." He took a step closer. "I miss our talks. I miss my friend." He was playing his last card, nostalgia. He was hoping to awaken some dormant ember of the life they had shared, the history that bound them. But Clara didn't even flicker. She simply looked at him with a profound, dispassionate clarity that chilled him to the bone. "We were never friends, David," she said, her voice devoid of anger, which was somehow worse. "Friends don't systematically dismantle each other's confidence. Friends don't call their partner's life's work a little hobby. Friends don't try to shrink someone so they can feel bigger." Each word was a calm, precise incision. "You're not here to apologize," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "You're here because your life is falling apart and you think I'm a life raft. You think you can manipulate me, use my connection to Liam to get back on your feet. You see me not as a person, but as an angle to be played." He opened his mouth to deny it, but no words came. She had seen right through him, down to the rotten core of his intentions. The realization that she knew him so completely and was so utterly unmoved was the most profound defeat of his life. "The woman you're looking for, the one who would have accepted your hollow apologies and soothed your bruised ego, she doesn't exist anymore," Clara said, her voice gaining a quiet strength. "You destroyed her, and from her ashes I built myself. So thank you for that, I suppose." She gave him a final, dismissive look. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." She turned her back on him and walked away, her focus already returned to the garden, to her creation, to her future. David stood alone amidst the dirt and the saplings, the city buzzing around him. The rejection was absolute. It wasn't fiery or dramatic. It was calm, clinical, and complete. It was the closing of a door he hadn't even realized he'd left open. He had come here seeking a lifeline, but all he found was the final crushing confirmation of his own irrelevance. He had hit rock bottom, and there was no one left to blame but himself. 6 months later, the air was crisp with the promise of spring. The Anna Sterling Memorial Garden was ready for its grand unveiling. The space was unrecognizable from the derelict plot it had once been. It was a living, breathing tapestry of color, texture, and life. Wildflowers swayed in the gentle breeze from the river. The sound of the central fountain was a soothing murmur, and the winding paths invited exploration and peace. Clara stood on a small dais, Liam by her side, addressing the crowd of city officials, donors, and journalists. She wore a simple, elegant blue dress, her face radiant, her voice clear and strong as she spoke about the power of public spaces to heal and connect communities. She spoke of Anna Sterling's vision and of the garden as a testament to resilience. She was poised, articulate, and utterly magnetic. From the very back of the crowd, shielded by the shade of a newly planted maple tree, David watched. He was a ghost at the feast. He looked different. The expensive tailored suit was gone, replaced by a simple jacket and jeans. There were lines of exhaustion around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He was thinner, humbled. His marriage to Sophie had ended a few months prior, not with a bang, but with the quiet signing of papers. Her father had made sure he walked away with nothing but his own debts. He had taken a junior analyst position at a small boutique firm, the kind of job he would have sneered at just a year ago. He lived in a small apartment in Queens. His world, once a glittering skyscraper, had been reduced to a walk-up. He hadn't come here to cause trouble or to try and speak to Clara. He had come because he needed to see it. He needed to understand. He listened to her speak, and for the first time, he heard her. He wasn't listening for how her words reflected on him. He was just listening. He saw the way she connected with the crowd, the passion in her eyes as she described the garden's design. He saw the quiet, steady way Liam looked at her, a look of pure, unadulterated admiration and love. And finally, he understood. He had thought Clara's light was something to be managed, controlled, and, if necessary, dimmed, lest it outshine his own. He had never grasped that her light was a force that could have warmed them both. His greatest failure wasn't losing his job or his trophy wife. His greatest failure was standing next to a sun and complaining that it was too bright. As the crowd erupted in applause, David turned to leave. He didn't feel the bitter envy or rage he had expected. He felt a profound, aching sadness, a grief for the man he could have been and the life he could have had if he hadn't been so blinded by his own hollow ambition. It wasn't about the money or the status. It was about connection, partnership and soul, all the things he had willingly traded away. Clara, finishing her speech, happened to glance toward the edge of the crowd. She saw a flicker of a familiar figure turning to walk away. Her heart gave a single strange beat, not of pain or anger, but of a distant, detached pity, a chapter closing for good. Then Liam's hand found hers, his fingers warm and steady. She squeezed it, turning her face back to him, back to the sun, back to the beautiful, thriving garden she had built from the ruins. David's path was his own now, a long, uncertain road toward finding a self-worth that couldn't be measured in dollars or headlines. Her path was here, in the rich, fertile soil of her own making, a future waiting to bloom. From the ashes of a painful past, Clara didn't just find revenge. She found herself. Her story is a powerful testament that your true value is never defined by someone else's inability to see it. It's about cultivating your own garden, nurturing your own passions, and having the courage to bloom even after the harshest winter. If you were inspired by Clara's journey from heartbreak to healing and empowerment, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder of their own strength and subscribe for more stories of resilience and redemption. What part of Clara's comeback resonated with you the most? Let me know in the comments below. What happens when a man who has everything realizes he's lost the only thing that ever mattered? Richard Sterling, a billionaire titan of industry, walked into his divorce, hearing convinced it was just another business deal to be closed. He had the power, the money, and the younger, glamorous woman on his arm. He thought he'd already won. But when his wife of 25 years, Catherine, walked into the courtroom, she wasn't the broken woman he expected. Her quiet dignity was an armor he couldn't breach, and in her eyes he saw the reflection of a man he no longer recognized. This is the story of a man who paid the ultimate price, not in dollars, but in regret. The air in courtroom 3B of the New York County Supreme Court was stale, tasting of old paper, cheap coffee, and the ghosts of 1,000 fractured promises. For Richard Sterling, it was just another room to be conquered. He sat at the polished mahogany table, a fortress of bespoke tailoring and quiet, indomitable confidence. His suit, a deep charcoal wool from a tailor in Savile Row, whose name was whispered, not spoken, cost more than the presiding judge's yearly salary. Beside him, his lawyer, Marcus Thorne, a man whose ruthlessness was as legendary as his fees, shuffled papers with practiced indifference. Richard glanced at his watch, a Patek Philippe Grandmaster chime, a symphony of complications on his wrist. They were waiting. He hated waiting. It was a concession of power, a momentary lapse in his meticulously orchestrated control of the universe. He expected this to be swift, a formality. Catherine, his wife of 25 years, soon to be ex-wife, had been a quiet partner, a homemaker, the elegant, unassuming woman who raised their 2 children and curated their life into a masterpiece of quiet luxury while he built an empire in steel and glass. He had been generous in his initial offer, insultingly so, designed to have her sign the papers and disappear into a comfortable, wealthy obscurity. But she had refused, an act of defiance so uncharacteristic it was almost amusing. The heavy courtroom doors swung open, and for a moment Richard's breath caught. It wasn't the woman he remembered. The Catherine he had left 6 months ago was a spectre of herself, her eyes hollowed by grief, her movements hesitant. The woman who walked in now was transformed. She wore a simple navy blue dress that spoke of elegance, not expense. Her silver-streaked brown hair, which he'd often criticized for making her look her age, was pulled back in a chic low bun that highlighted the fine bones of her face. There were lines around her eyes and mouth, but they no longer looked like fissures of sadness. They looked like etchings of wisdom, of resilience. She was thinner, yes, but she held herself with a straight-backed poise that seemed to radiate a quiet, unshakable strength. She wasn't leaning on her lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s. She was walking beside her, an equal. Their eyes met across the hushed room. Richard had expected to see pain, anger, perhaps even desperation. He saw none of it. He saw a calm, clear-eyed assessment. It was the look of a stranger evaluating him, and it was more unsettling than any scream or sob could ever have been. It was as if she was looking straight through the billion-dollar facade, the Patek on his wrist, the headline-making deals, and seeing the hollow man beneath. In that moment, the cavernous courtroom felt less like his stage and more like a hall of mirrors, each one reflecting a version of himself he didn't want to see. "All rise," the bailiff droned, and the proceedings began. Marcus was masterful. He painted a picture of Richard as a titan of industry, a generous husband whose wife had enjoyed a life of unimaginable privilege. He spoke of assets, portfolios, and the sheer scale of the sterling fortune, subtly framing Catherine's claim as an audacious overreach. "Mrs. Sterling contributed nothing to the accumulation of this wealth," Marcus stated, his voice smooth as silk. "She was a homemaker, a wonderful mother, no doubt, but her role was in the domestic sphere, entirely separate from Mr. Sterling's business endeavors." Richard nodded slightly, the narrative aligning perfectly with his own. He had built it all. Every skyscraper, every deal, every billion. Catherine had spent it. It was a simple, clean transaction in his mind. Then Catherine's lawyer, a woman named Helen Pierce, stood up. She didn't have Marcus's theatrical flair, but she had a presence that was just as commanding. It was the quiet authority of someone who held all the cards. "Your Honor," Helen began, her voice steady and clear, "we contest the notion that my client, Catherine Vance, was merely a homemaker. While she did raise 2 exceptional children and manage multiple properties, her contribution to Mr. Sterling's empire began long before the empire existed." She produced a document, a faded, typewritten business plan from 1998. "This is the original proposal for Sterling Properties, LLC, the market analysis, the 5-year growth projections. They were written by Catherine Vance, then a recent graduate with a master's in urban planning, on a second-hand typewriter in their 2-bedroom apartment in Queens." A murmur rippled through the room. Richard stared at the document, a relic from a life he'd long since buried. He remembered that apartment, the leaky faucet, the smell of Catherine's coffee as she worked late into the night, her brow furrowed in concentration, believing in him more than he believed in himself. He'd forgotten. He had actively, methodically forgotten. Helen wasn't finished. She presented architectural sketches for his first major development, hand-drawn with a precision and vision that were undeniable. These initial designs, which saved Mr. Sterling over $1 million in architectural fees and won him the bid, were also created by my client. One by one, Helen Pierce dismantled the myth of Richard Sterling, the solitary genius. She revealed the woman who had been his co-pilot, his strategist, his intellectual partner, before he had decided her role was better suited to picking out china patterns and charity galas. She wasn't asking for half of his fortune because she was his wife. She was asking for her equity, the long overdue payment for a co-founder who had been systematically erased from the company's history. Richard felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't a divorce. It was a corporate dissolution. He looked at Catherine again. Her expression hadn't changed. There was no triumph, no smug, "I told you so." There was only that same unnerving calm, the calm of someone who was not there to fight over money, but to reclaim a truth he had stolen from her. The Patek on his wrist suddenly felt heavy, vulgar. For the first time in decades, Richard Sterling felt the one thing he'd built his entire life to avoid, a complete and utter loss of control. The empire he thought was his alone had foundations he hadn't built, and the architect was finally calling in her due. The ride back to his penthouse was a silent, tense affair. The city blurred past the tinted windows of the Maybach, a concrete and glass kingdom that usually made Richard feel powerful. Today it felt like a monument to his own ignorance. Isabelle Dubois, the woman for whom he detonated his life, sat beside him, her perfume, a sharp, expensive scent called Scandal, filling the small space. "That woman has some nerve," Isabelle said, breaking the silence. Her voice, usually a purr, had a brittle edge. "An urban planning degree, please." As if that qualifies her to run a lemonade stand, let alone a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. She ran a perfectly manicured hand down his arm. Her touch was meant to be soothing, but it felt like the scrape of a key on a locked door. Richard didn't respond. He was replaying the moment Helen Pierce had presented that old business plan. He could suddenly smell the dust on their old bookshelf, see the chipped rim of the coffee mug Catherine used, hear the clatter of the typewriter keys. It was a memory so vivid, so real, it made the opulent leather interior of the car feel like a cheap movie set. "Richard, darling, don't let her get to you," Isabelle continued, her tone softening into practiced concern. "This is what they do. They get bitter. They try to rewrite history to squeeze out a few extra million. Marcus will handle her." But Richard knew it wasn't about a few extra million. It was about the truth. A truth he had conveniently packaged and stored in the attic of his mind. Catherine hadn't just typed the plan. She had debated every point with him, challenged his assumptions, and built the very intellectual framework he had later claimed as his own singular genius. They arrived at the penthouse, a glass box perched 50 stories above Central Park. It was a space designed to impress, with minimalist furniture, museum-quality art, and panoramic views that stretched to the horizon. It was Isabelle's dream, a stage for the life she wanted to lead. But as Richard walked in, the gleaming marble floors and vast empty spaces felt cold and sterile. It wasn't a home, it was a showroom. Their home, his real home, had been a sprawling pre-war apartment on the Upper East Side. It was filled with the comfortable clutter of a life well lived, stacks of books, his children's art projects framed on the walls, a slightly worn armchair where he used to read the paper. Catherine had made it a sanctuary. Isabelle had made this place a statement. "I'll have Antoine mix us some martinis," she said, slipping off her heels. "We'll forget all about this ugly business." Richard walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the city. He could see the top of the Sterling Tower, the flagship of his empire, its spire piercing the clouds. He had stood here countless times, feeling like a king surveying his domain. Now he felt a profound, unsettling loneliness. His phone buzzed. It was his son, Leo, a sophomore at Stanford. Richard's heart gave a hopeful leap. He hadn't spoken to Leo in weeks. "Leo," he answered, trying to keep his voice even. "I heard about court." Leo's voice was flat, devoid of warmth. "Grandma told me." "It's just proceedings, son. Lawyers talking." A bitter laugh came through the phone. "Lawyers talking? Dad, they're talking about my mother's life, the life you're trying to erase." The accusation hit him like a physical blow. "That's not what's happening." "Isn't it? You left her for your assistant. You moved into some glass palace and you expect her to just vanish with a check. Did you forget everything she did?" "I haven't. I remember her grading papers and marking up your proposals while you were out networking. I remember her designing the layout for the lake house because you said the architects were idiots. We all remember, Dad. You're the only one who forgot." Each word was a nail in the coffin of his self-deception. This wasn't just Catherine's fight. It was his children's. He was losing them, not in a custody battle, but in the war for their respect. "Leo, he started, but no words came. What could he say? "I'm sorry. I was blinded by a pretty face and the thrill of feeling young again. I'm sorry. I devalued your mother because it made me feel more powerful." "Just don't," Leo said, his voice cracking with an anger he could no longer contain. "Don't call me until you've figured out how to tell the truth, to yourself, for a start." The line went dead. Richard stood, the silent phone in his hand, the city lights beginning to glitter below. Isabel returned, holding 2 perfectly chilled martini glasses. She smiled, a dazzling, flawless expression that didn't reach her eyes. "There you are, darling. See? Everything is better already." She held out the glass. He looked from the drink to her face, a face he had once thought was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Now he saw the calculation behind the eyes, the ambition behind the smile. She wasn't his partner. She was his successor. She didn't love him. She loved what he represented. The realization dawned with a terrifying clarity. He hadn't traded his old life for a better one. He had traded a real home for a gilded cage, a true partner for a beautiful warden, and in the process he had locked himself inside with his own ghosts. Catherine Vance's new life was measured in blocks, not miles. She lived in a modest but elegant brownstone in Brooklyn, a world away from the chauffeured cars and cavernous rooms of her past. Her days no longer revolved around charity boards, dinner party menus, or Richard's unpredictable schedule. They revolved around the steady, satisfying work of rebuilding. Her apartment was filled with light, plants, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee and old books. On a large drafting table by the window, architectural plans were spread out, held down by smooth stones her daughter, Sophie, had collected from a beach in Montauk years ago. After a 2-decade hiatus, Catherine had started her own small firm, specializing in sustainable urban residential design. It was terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time in years, her identity wasn't reflected in Richard's shadow. It was being built, beam by beam, by her own hands. This morning, she stood by the window, mug in hand, watching the neighborhood wake up. People walked their dogs. Children cycled to school. The scent of bagels drifted from the corner deli. It was a life of simple, tangible connections, and it was more grounding than all the galas and private jets had ever been. Her phone buzzed. It was her lawyer, Helen. "He's rattled," Helen said, her voice crisp. "Marcus Thorne called me twice last night, first with threats, then with a new offer. He doubled it." Catherine took a slow sip of coffee. "It's not about the money, Helen." "I know," Helen replied, a hint of admiration in her tone. "That's why we're going to win. Not just the settlement, Catherine. We're going to win the narrative. Your story will be told." After hanging up, Catherine walked over to the drafting table. The project she was working on was a community center for a low-income neighborhood. It was complex, underfunded, and profoundly meaningful. As she picked up a pencil, its familiar weight a comfort in her hand, her mind drifted back. She remembered one night, 15 years ago. Their daughter, Sophie, then 6 years old, had a severe asthma attack in the middle of the night. It was terrifying. Catherine had rushed her to the emergency room, spending 8 frantic hours in the sterile, beeping chaos while doctors worked to stabilize her breathing. Richard was supposed to be in Chicago for a conference. She had called him, her voice shaking, leaving a desperate voicemail. He never called back. The next morning, as Sophie slept soundly in a hospital bed, Catherine saw a photo in an online gossip column. It was Richard, not in Chicago, but at a glamorous hotel opening in Miami. Standing beside him, her hand possessively on his arm, was his new, impossibly young executive assistant, Isabelle Dubois. The headline read, "Billionaire Richard Sterling and a mystery brunette heat up South Beach." The world had tilted on its axis. It wasn't just the infidelity, it was the casual cruelty of it. While she was terrified for their child's life, he was sipping champagne, building a new life on the ashes of their vows. When he finally returned home 2 days later, he was armed with excuses: a last-minute flight change, a dead phone battery, a crucial investor meeting. She didn't believe a word, but she confronted him with a cold, quiet fury. He didn't confess. He deflected, accused her of being hysterical, of not trusting him. "It was a work event, Catherine. You're making a scandal out of nothing. Isabelle is a valuable employee, that's all." But the lie was there, slick and ugly in his eyes, and in that moment she understood the new power imbalance in their marriage. He wasn't just her husband anymore. He was Richard Sterling TM, a brand, an entity so powerful he believed he could rewrite reality itself. To challenge him would mean a war she wasn't equipped to fight, not then. With 2 young children and a life entirely interwoven with his, she felt trapped. So she made a calculated decision. She would stay not as a wife, but as a custodian of her children's stability. She would play the part, smile at the parties, and wait. She would wait for the day her children were grown, for the day she had the strength to reclaim herself. That day had come. The ringing of her doorbell pulled her back to the present. It was Sophie, now a bright, empathetic freshman at NYU, home for the weekend. She bounded in, dropping a bag of groceries on the counter and enveloping Catherine in a hug. "I brought you that weird oat milk you like," Sophie said, her voice muffled in her mother's shoulder. "And I saw the headlines. Are you okay?" Catherine held her daughter tight. "I'm more than okay, sweetheart. I'm finally myself." Sophie pulled back, her eyes so like Richard's but filled with a warmth he'd lost, scanning her mother's face. "He's an idiot, Mom. He threw away the best thing in his life." Catherine smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. "No, honey, he didn't throw me away. He just set me free." They spent the rest of the day together, not talking about the divorce, but about Sophie's classes, the progress on the community center, a funny movie they wanted to see. It was a normal day, beautifully, wonderfully normal. As evening fell, Catherine looked around her small, light-filled apartment, at her daughter laughing, at the plans on her table, at the life she was building from the ground up. She felt no bitterness, no consuming anger, only a profound sense of peace. Richard had thought her life was a gilded cage of his making. He never understood the truth. She had always held the key. He was the one who was truly imprisoned. The discovery phase of the divorce was meant to be a war of attrition. Richard's legal team, a phalanx of the most expensive sharks in Manhattan, descended with a storm of motions and subpoenas designed to overwhelm, intimidate, and exhaust Catherine into submission. They demanded decades of credit card statements, diaries, personal emails, anything to paint her as a profligate spender, an unstable woman, a gold digger. Richard had approved the strategy, albeit with a growing sense of unease. It was standard procedure, Marcus had assured him. We need to control the narrative, Richard. We define her before she can define you. But the narrative wasn't cooperating. Helen Pierce and her small, meticulous team met their onslaught not with equal aggression, but with calm, unassailable facts. For every claim of extravagance, they produced a receipt showing the expense was for a family need or a business function. For every insinuation of instability, they produced glowing letters from teachers, friends, and charity board members. They were building a portrait of Catherine, not as a spender, but as the COO of the Sterling family, a shrewd manager, a community leader, and a devoted mother. The turning point came during a deposition. Richard sat in a sterile conference room, Isabel by his side, a move Marcus had advised against but Isabel had insisted upon, as Helen Pierce questioned one of his oldest business partners, a man named George Friedman. George was a gruff, old-school developer who had worked with Richard on his first skyscraper project. He was a Sterling loyalist, and Richard expected him to toe the company line. Helen began gently, asking George about the early days. "Mr. Friedman, do you recall the bidding process for the Blackwood Tower?" "Of course," George grunted. "Tough fight. We were the underdogs." "And what gave Sterling Properties the edge?" Helen asked, her tone conversational. "Richard," George said, nodding towards him. "He had a vision and a killer financial model." "Ah, yes, the financial model," Helen said, consulting her notes. "The one that demonstrated how a phased construction schedule, tied to pre-lease agreements, could significantly reduce upfront capital risk. It was brilliant, revolutionary at the time." "Damn right it was," George said proudly. "Who developed that model?" George shifted in his seat. "Well, Richard, of course." Helen paused, letting the silence hang in the air. Then she slid a folder across the table. "I'd like to enter into Evidence Exhibit 27B. These are pages from a graduate thesis submitted to Columbia University in 1996. The title is Risk Mitigation in Large-Scale Urban Redevelopment Through Phased Financial Structuring." Richard's blood ran cold. He knew that title. "The author of this thesis," Helen continued, her voice level, "was Catherine Vance. Could you take a look at page 47, Mr. Friedman, and tell me if you recognize the core principles of the financial model you used for the Blackwood Tower?" George put on his glasses and peered at the document. A long moment passed. He looked up, first at Helen, then at Richard, his expression a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. The room was silent. Richard felt Isabel's hand tighten on his arm. He refused to look at her. He was staring at the copy of Catherine's thesis, a document he hadn't thought about in 25 years. He had dismissed it at the time, called it academic nonsense. But he had read it. He had absorbed its ideas, internalized its logic, and then seamlessly presented it as his own. It wasn't conscious theft, not exactly. It was more insidious. It was the slow, arrogant absorption of her intellect, a kind of intellectual vampirism he hadn't even recognized he was committing. "This changes nothing," Marcus blustered later, back in his office. "Ideas are cheap. Execution is everything. You executed, Richard." But it changed everything. The story he told himself, the myth of the self-made man who had dragged his family up from nothing, was unraveling. He wasn't a solo act. He had a silent partner, one whose contributions he had not only ignored, but actively erased. That evening the penthouse felt smaller, the walls closing in. Isabel was planning a party, a lavish affair to show everyone we're unbothered. She chattered on about guest lists and caterers, her voice a grating counterpoint to the turmoil in his head. "We'll invite the Van der Geldens, of course, and I think we can finally get the mayor to commit," she said, scrolling through her phone. "This will be the perfect way to announce our engagement officially." Engagement. The word hung in the air, alien and wrong. He looked at her, truly looked at her, as she meticulously curated a list of people who mattered only for their status. She wasn't building a life with him. She was executing a merger. Catherine had helped him lay the foundation of an empire. Isabel was just there to redecorate the throne room. He walked into his home office and closed the door. On his desk was a framed photo. It was from a decade ago, the four of them on a sailboat. He, Catherine, a teenage Leo, and a gap-toothed Sophie, all windswept and laughing. They looked happy. They looked real. He had been so busy building a legacy of steel and glass, he hadn't realized he was already living inside his true legacy, and he was the one taking a sledgehammer to it. He picked up the phone and dialed his sister. "Carol," he said, his voice hoarse, "I need to talk." "It's about time," she replied, her voice filled with a weary sadness. "I've been waiting for this call for 6 months, Richie. What have you done?" Richard started avoiding the penthouse. He told Isabel he was consumed by a hostile takeover bid, a lie she readily accepted, as business was the only language she truly respected. In reality, he was adrift. He took a room at the Carlyle, a place of old-world quiet that felt more authentic than his glass box in the sky. He spent his days walking the city, not as a conqueror in a Maybach, but as a ghost on the sidewalk. He walked past the old apartment in Queens, now gentrified beyond recognition. He stood outside the pre-war building on the Upper East Side, staring up at the windows of what was once his home, now just another asset to be divided. He was trying to find the man he used to be, the ambitious but hopeful young husband who had shared dreams with his wife over a rickety kitchen table. But he couldn't find him. That man was a foreigner from a distant past. His sister Carol's words echoed in his head. "You didn't just leave a marriage, Richie. You left a family. You left yourself. That woman, Isabel, she's not in love with you. She's in love with your balance sheet. Catherine loved you, the angry, insecure, brilliant man who was terrified of failing. You've become the one thing you always hated, a cliché." One rainy Tuesday afternoon, driven by an impulse he didn't understand, he found himself in Brooklyn. He stood across the street from Catherine's brownstone, a pathetic cliché of a different kind, the spurned husband lurking in the shadows. He watched as she came out holding an umbrella, her focus on the architectural drawings tucked under her arm. She was heading to a meeting, her expression determined and alive. She looked happy, truly, deeply happy. The sight didn't spark jealousy or anger in him, but a profound, aching sadness. Her happiness had nothing to do with him anymore. He had become irrelevant to her life. As she walked towards the subway station, a gust of wind caught her umbrella, wrenching it from her grasp. It skittered across the wet pavement as her drawings scattered into a puddle. "Oh no!" she cried out, a sound of pure frustration. Before he could think, Richard was moving. He ran across the street, ignoring the blare of a taxi horn. He knelt, gathering the soggy papers, his expensive suit jacket soaking up the grimy water. He retrieved her umbrella and walked towards her, his heart hammering against his ribs. She looked up, her eyes widening in shock as she recognized him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain fell around them, a curtain separating them from the rest of the world. "Richard," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Your plans," he said numbly, holding out the dripping papers. "I'm sorry, they're ruined." She took them, a sad smile touching her lips. "It's all right. They're just copies. Thank you." The awkward silence stretched. What were you supposed to say to the woman whose life you had systematically dismantled? Sorry for everything? It felt so laughably inadequate. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice not accusatory, just curious. I don't know," he admitted, the truth sounding hollow even to his own ears. "I was just walking." She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time he saw a flicker of the old Catherine, the woman who could read him better than anyone. She saw past the suit, the wealth, the bluster. She saw the lost man standing in the rain. "You look tired, Richard," she said softly. The simple, honest observation broke something in him. He hadn't felt seen in months. Isabel saw his power. His lawyers saw his assets. His children saw his betrayal. Catherine just saw that he was tired. "I am," he confessed. "I've made a mess of everything." "Yes," she said, not unkindly. You have. She didn't offer false comfort or easy absolution. She just offered the truth, a commodity that had been in short supply in his life. But a mess can be cleaned up, or you can learn to live with it. What are you going to do? He looked from her clear, steady eyes to the ruined drawings in her hand. He had destroyed something beautiful, something they had built together, and replaced it with a cheap, gaudy imitation. And here she was, in the rain, already drawing up new plans, building something new and strong on her own. I think, he began, the words feeling foreign and clumsy on his tongue, I have to start by telling the truth. That's a good place to start, she said. She gave him a small, final nod, turned and walked away, her new umbrella held steady against the rain. Richard stood there, soaked to the bone, watching her go. He wasn't in love with her anymore, not in the way he had been. The romantic love was a casualty of his own war. But in its place was a vast, humbling respect, a sense of awe for her resilience, her integrity, and a dawning, terrifying understanding of the magnitude of his loss. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost his anchor, his conscience, his truth. And now he had to find his way back to shore, alone. The first step was not a courtroom, but a confession. The next court date felt different. The air was still thick with tension, but Richard's own energy had shifted. He walked in not with the swagger of a king, but with the somber gait of a man heading to a reckoning. He had instructed Marcus to drop the aggressive tactics. There would be no more smearing of Catherine's character, no more attempts to minimize her contributions. Isabel was not with him. Their final conversation had been short and brutal. He had told her he was offering Catherine a settlement far beyond what Marcus advised, a true half of the fortune, plus a controlling interest in the philanthropic foundation Catherine had founded and he had sidelined. "Are you insane?" Isabel had shrieked, her mask of cool sophistication shattering into 1,000 pieces of raw fury. "You're giving that woman, that homemaker, billions? That's our money, our future." "No, Isabel," he had said, a strange calm settling over him. "It's my debt, and it's past time I paid it." Her eyes had turned to ice. "You'll regret this, Richard. I will make sure of it." The threat was empty. She had no power over him anymore, because he no longer cared what she or anyone in their hollow social circle thought. Now, in the courtroom, he sat alone at his table. He saw Catherine and Helen Pierce take their seats. Catherine's eyes met his briefly, a question in them. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. When the judge called the proceedings to order, before Marcus or Helen could speak, Richard stood up. A shocked silence fell over the room. "Your Honor," Richard said, his voice clear and steady, resonating in the quiet space. "May I address the court?" The judge, a stern-faced woman who had seen everything, looked surprised but intrigued. "Mr. Sterling, this is highly unorthodox. Your counsel is here to speak for you." "I understand, Your Honor, but there are some things a man must say for himself." The judge considered him for a long moment, then nodded. "Proceed, but be brief." Richard didn't look at his notes. He didn't look at the judge. He turned and looked directly at Catherine. He was not speaking to the court. He was speaking to her. "For the past 6 months," he began, "my legal team, under my direction, has attempted to paint a picture of my wife, Catherine Vance, as a peripheral figure in my life and my success. They have tried to frame her as a homemaker who is now making an outrageous claim on a fortune she did not help create. Your Honor, I am here today to state for the record that this narrative is a lie that I, myself, have perpetrated for many years." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Marcus Thorne looked as if he might faint. "The truth," Richard continued, his voice unwavering, "is that there would be no Sterling properties without Catherine Vance. The business plan was born from her intellect. The first designs were from her hand. The financial models that secured our first major loans were adapted from her graduate thesis. She was my partner in every sense of the word, until my own ego grew so large that I no longer had room for a partner. I wanted an audience, and she would not applaud a man she no longer respected. He took a breath, the confession feeling like a physical weight being lifted from his chest. I systematically erased her contributions, taking credit for her ideas and her labor, not just from our public history, but from our private one. I convinced myself that the myth of the lone genius was the truth. It was easier than admitting I was part of a team, because it would have meant acknowledging how much I owed her, how much I depended on her. I failed her as a business partner, and I failed her as a husband. He finally broke eye contact with Catherine and looked at the judge. I have disrespected this court by wasting its time with false arguments, but my true crime was against my family. I betrayed their trust, and I have caused them immeasurable pain, for which I am profoundly sorry. Therefore, I am withdrawing all of our previous offers and arguments. I have instructed my counsel to accept Ms. Vance's original proposal in its entirety. She is not taking half of my company. She is finally claiming her stake in ours. He finished, his words hanging in the stunned silence. He had just publicly dismantled his own myth, admitted to being a fraud, and given away billions of dollars. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt a sense of integrity. He felt clean. He looked back at Catherine. A single tear was tracing a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of triumph or of pity. It looked like a tear of grief, for the man he could have been, for the marriage they could have had. Helen Pierce rose slowly. Your Honor, in light of Mr. Sterling's statement, we accept. The judge banged her gavel, her expression unreadable. This court is adjourned. Richard didn't wait. He turned and walked out of the courtroom, alone. He didn't know what came next. He had torched his old life, and he had no map for a new one. But as he stepped out into the bright, indifferent sunlight of a New York afternoon, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt free, not from a marriage, but from the prison of his own lies. The cost had been immense, but for the first time he understood the difference between price and value. He had lost a fortune, but he had just bought back his soul. The days following the courtroom confession were a study in solitude. The news of Richard's public self-immolation spread like wildfire through the financial world. Some called him a fool. Others, in hushed tones, called him a man of honor. Most just saw him as a cautionary tale. He ignored the calls from journalists, the shocked emails from board members, the furious, threatening texts from Isabel. He was an island surrounded by the wreckage of his own making. He sold the penthouse. The transaction was swift and clinical. He packed a single suitcase and moved into a residential hotel, a place of quiet anonymity. He spent hours walking through Central Park, watching families, listening to the laughter of children, feeling like a ghost observing a world to which he no longer belonged. His first real step out of the purgatory was a call to his son. It was the hardest call he'd ever had to make. Leo answered on the third ring. I read what you did, he said, his voice cautious, the anger replaced by a wary curiosity. It was the truth, Richard said simply. A long pause. Why now, Dad? Why after all this? Richard sat on a park bench, the autumn leaves skittering around his feet. Because I finally looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the man I saw. Because I realized I was about to lose the only two people in the world who share my blood, and my last name, and my stupidly oversized ears. A small choked sound came from Leo's end. It might have been a laugh. I hurt you, Leo, and I hurt Sophie, and I hurt your mother more than I can ever comprehend. There's no excuse. I was arrogant, I was selfish, and I was a coward. I can't undo it. All I can do is try to be a different man from this day forward. What does that mean? Leo asked, the question raw and genuine. I don't know yet, Richard admitted, but it starts with this, with telling you that my greatest regret isn't losing the money, it's losing your respect. More silence. Richard held his breath, willing his son to say something, anything. Mum said you always had a conscience. Leo said finally, his voice soft. She said you just buried it under a lot of expensive concrete. Maybe she was right. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't absolution, but it was a door, cracked open, just a sliver. "Can I call again?" Richard asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Yeah, Dad," Leo said. "You can call again." Buoyed by that small victory, Richard began the arduous process of untangling his life. He stepped down as CEO of Sterling Properties, handing the reins to a trusted successor. He put his focus into the foundation that Catherine was now running, not as a leader, but as a quiet background advisor, offering his knowledge when asked, but never his opinion unless solicited. He was learning to serve instead of command. He saw Catherine once, a month after the divorce was finalized. They met at a neutral coffee shop to sign some final transfer documents. She looked serene, her energy focused and bright. She told him about the community center she was designing, her eyes lit with passion. "The Foundation's new focus on urban renewal has been a godsend," she said. "We can actually make a real difference now." "That was always your vision for it," he said, remembering how he'd pushed her towards funding art museums and opera houses, things he considered more prestigious. "Yes," she said without accusation. "It was." As they prepared to leave, an awkwardness settled between them. 25 years of shared history, now reduced to a polite business meeting. "Richard," she said, pausing at the door, "what Leo and Sophie needed, what they still need, is a father, not a bank account. I hope you can be that for them." "I'm trying," he said. "It's the only work that matters to me now." She gave him a small, sad smile and left. He watched her walk down the street, a woman complete in her own life, a life that no longer had a space for him. The finality of it was a quiet, constant ache. There would be no reconciliation, no Hollywood ending where they found their way back to each other. He had broken that bond too thoroughly. The only thing left to do was to honor the pieces that remained, their children, and the shared history he was finally beginning to understand. He had to learn to be a good man, not to win her back, but simply because it was the right thing to do. 6 months later, spring was breathing new life into the city. Richard Sterling no longer lived in a hotel. He had bought a small apartment, by his old standards anyway, overlooking the Hudson River. It was a space defined by books, not art, by comfort, not style. It was a place for living, not for showing off. His life had found a new, quieter rhythm. He worked part-time, consulting for a non-profit that built affordable housing. The pay was nominal, but the work was tangible, real. He was building homes, not monuments to his own ego. His relationship with his children was a slow, careful reconstruction. He flew to California once a month to have dinner with Leo. They talked about books, politics, Leo's dreams of becoming a documentary filmmaker. They didn't talk much about the past. They were focused on building a new present. With Sophie, it was different. She was closer, both in proximity and in spirit. They met for brunch every Sunday in her neighborhood. He listened to her talk about her classes, her friends, her frustrations. He learned more about his daughter in those few months than he had in the previous 10 years. He learned to just listen, to offer support instead of solutions, to be a father instead of a CEO. One sunny Saturday, he attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the community center Catherine had designed. He stood at the back of the crowd, unnoticed. He watched as she spoke to the crowd, her voice filled with passion and pride. She didn't talk about concrete and steel. She talked about creating a safe space for children, a place of learning for adults, a heart for the neighborhood. She was magnificent. He saw Sophie and Leo standing in the front row, watching their mother with shining eyes. After the ceremony, he saw them rush to hug her, a tight family unit. For a fleeting moment, a sharp pang of regret hit him. He should have been standing with them. He should have been part of that circle. But the feeling passed, replaced by a quiet sense of gratitude. They were okay. His children were thriving, and their mother was happy and fulfilled. His selfish actions had caused a devastating earthquake, but from the rubble they had all managed to build something new and strong. He was about to slip away when he heard his name. "Dad?" It was Sophie. She had seen him. She walked over, a bright smile on her face. "I was hoping you'd come." "I wouldn't have missed it," he said. "Your mother, she's done something incredible here." "Yeah, she has," Sophie agreed. "We're all going for pizza to celebrate. You should come." The invitation hung in the air, simple and momentous. It was the first time they had invited him into their new life, their new configuration of family. He looked over her shoulder and saw Catherine and Leo watching them. Catherine gave him a small, neutral nod. It wasn't a welcome, not exactly. It was an allowance, an acknowledgement that he was their father, and that he had a place, albeit a new and different one. "I'd like that very much," Richard said, his voice thick. He walked with his daughter towards his son and the woman who was once his wife. It wasn't the life he had once envisioned, glittering with power and prestige. It was something smaller, quieter, and infinitely more valuable. It was a life built not on the shifting sands of wealth and ego, but on the bedrock of forgiveness, second chances, and the enduring, complicated bonds of family. He had lost an empire, but he was slowly, carefully rebuilding a home. Richard Sterling's story is a powerful reminder that the most valuable assets we have can't be listed on a stock exchange. It's about realizing that true wealth is measured in trust, respect, and the love of family. Things that, once broken, are the hardest to rebuild. His journey from arrogance to accountability shows that redemption isn't a destination. It's a difficult, day-by-day process of choosing to be a better person. It's a choice we all have to make in our own lives. If this story of betrayal, regret, and the slow path to redemption moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates deep, emotional storytelling. For more content that explores the complexities of the human heart, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think was the true turning point for Richard?